Amen. Amen. Well, as Peter now comes to the end of his letter to Christian believers throughout Asia Minor, he is pastorally aware of just how discouraged and disappointed his readers are feeling. They're discouraged and disappointed because they've just been experiencing shame, humiliation, and rejection as they've sought to follow Jesus. And it's beginning to really take a toll on them. And Peter's aware of this. He knows and he's sensitive to his readers. Following Jesus has cost Peter's readers their social status, which they've spent their whole lives building up and cultivating for themselves. For Peter's readers, their relationship with Jesus Christ has actually made their relationships with their family members and friends more complicated and difficult. His readers are worried. They're worried about losing their jobs and in some rare cases their very lives because of their close association with Jesus. People, even the best of us, can only take so many rotten tomatoes to the face before you begin to second guess even your most deeply held convictions. And it makes sense that people would start questioning those convictions that they hold, especially when they make their lives way more miserable, costly, and difficult than they'd ever been before. So Peter's readers are asking questions like these to themselves. Is following Jesus really worth it? Is following Jesus really worth it? Wouldn't we all be better off if we just went along with the flow? What's so bad about living and thinking like everybody else does? Doesn't the nail that sticks out get hammered down? Peter's readers needed help dealing with very real worries, anxieties, and cares that they were facing as ordinary Christians living in a hostile culture and world. And we share this very same need today as Peter's readers did in the past for help in dealing with our own anxieties, as we also live in a culture and a world that opposes Jesus and his kingdom. Maybe some of you tonight are feeling overwhelmed, like Peter's readers did, by the various worries of your own life, your own relationships, and your own family. Peter provides pastoral care, wisdom, and instruction to his readers, and by extension to us, for how we are to deal with our anxieties as followers of Jesus. And so there are two questions about dealing with our anxieties that I want to explore in the time that we have this evening through our passage. First, I want to consider this question: how do we deal with our anxieties normally? How do we normally or tend to deal with our anxieties? And the second question I want to consider is this: how does God deal with our anxieties? First, how do we deal with our anxieties? And second, how does God deal with our anxieties? Let's start with that first question. How do we deal with our anxieties? I believe we tend to deal with our anxieties in one of two ways, at least one of two ways. I'm sure there are many other ways that we might deal with them. But one way that we deal with our anxieties is we avoid them. We try to avoid them. And the second way that we tend to deal with our anxieties is we hoard them. We hold on to them. And so let me briefly explain what I mean by both of these. First, we often deal with our anxieties by trying to avoid them completely. When we're anxious, we have a tendency to try to avoid thinking or reflecting on whatever might be making us anxious. We might try to avoid our anxieties by diving headlong into our work. We're just too busy to think about what's going on in our lives. We've got too much to do on our to-do list to worry about anything. The Martha in Luke chapter 10 is a good example of a person who is so consumed by work and is using work and service even to the Lord, even to Jesus, to avoid the things that she's dealing with in her own life. Like Martha, we too can become blind and unaware to just how anxious and worried we might be. Right? Martha is serving Jesus at the table while Mary is at Jesus' feet. And Martha is looking at her sister Mary and complains to Jesus about her. Jesus, shouldn't she be helping me set the table and serve the food? And this is what Jesus says to her, recorded in Luke chapter 10. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Jesus at some times has to point out to us the fact that we are actually anxious and that we are worried. We can become blind to our own anxiousness and worry like Martha does. We might try to avoid our anxieties by distracting ourselves with entertainment, whether it be music, television, or any of our hobbies that we might like. None of these things are wrong, but we can use them in wrong ways to avoid the fears and the insecurities that we have in our own lives. We might try to avoid our anxieties by devoting ourselves even to God, by using prayer and service in the church and worship and preaching and Bible study to avoid our anxieties. We can use pretty much anything in our lives, whether it be our work or our family or our entertainment or spirituality and faith, to avoid our anxiousness, the deep anxiousness within us. Whenever my parents would gently ask my Korean grandma if she was stressed, because she was just very stressed. It's like you can sometimes see, your grandma's cooking in the kitchen, and you're just like, she is not happy. She's stressed. There's a million pots of boiling water. The tea kettle is going on. The meat is cooking, and there's just a million things. Whenever my parents would ask my Korean grandma, how are you doing? Are you feeling anxious or stressed? She would often respond like this. She'd say, oh, I'm not stressed. I'm not stressed about anything. I'm not anxious. I have no worries because I have Jesus. How can I be anxious if Jesus is with me? This is often how many of us, not all of us, but some of us might respond. We, as Christians, that we think, I'm not allowed to be anxious. I'm not allowed to have worries because I'm with Jesus. I call this, or you could call this the Lion King philosophy of dealing with one's anxieties, right? That famous song, Hakuna Matata, right? Hakuna Matata. What a wonderful phrase. Hakuna Matata ain't no passing craze. It means no worries. For the rest of your days, it's our problem-free philosophy. Hakuna Matata. So even as Christians, we can use even our relationship with Jesus as a way to avoid our anxieties. And so one way we often deal with our anxieties is we avoid them or we deny them completely. A second way that we might deal with our anxieties is by hoarding them, by holding on to them. When we're stressed or anxious, it's very easy for us to cling to our worries and fears. We just can't let them go. Our anxieties can become familiar and comforting to us in a strange and often unhelpful way. We're afraid that if we let go of our anxieties, our world and our lives would completely fall apart. In the documentary series Hoarders on the A&E network, you can watch clip after clip of this shared fear that every person struggling with hoarding faces. It's the fear of letting things go. A person's home might be filled from the floor to the ceiling with mountains and upon mountains of boxes of stuff and debris threatening their own safety and health and livelihood, and yet it's extremely difficult for them to let go of a single item. We can treat our anxieties similarly. We can hoard them inside of ourselves until finally they start spilling out into the front yard and the driveway of our lives. And that's often the point when we or the people in our lives who care about us start reaching out for help. And so those are the two ways that I think we tend to deal with our anxieties. We have a tendency to avoid them, distract ourselves, not think about them, sing, I have Jesus, so I'm not worried, even when we really are. Or we hoard them, we hold on to them. We just can't let them go, even though it's hurting us, even though it's hurting the people around us. And so I'd like you to just consider, for a moment, how do you tend to deal with anxiety in your life? Do you tend to avoid your anxieties by diving into your work, your service, your family, or your faith? Or do you tend to hoard your anxieties? You find that you just can't let them go. Or maybe you're just somewhere in between. Maybe it changes by the day. Some days you're more, I'm going to avoid my anxieties, and the other times you hoard them and hold on to them. Having explored that question of how we tend to deal with our anxieties, I want to spend the majority of our time together considering this next question. How does God deal with our anxieties? How does God deal with our anxieties? In 1 Peter 5, verse 5, right, just the section before this one, Peter quotes from Proverbs 3, verse 34, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. In that previous passage, Peter is saying that he expects, in teaching that this expectation that the elders and members of the church under his care and oversight would clothe themselves with humility toward one another, because God promises his grace to those who do so. And it's in light of this commitment, God's commitment to supply grace to the humble, that Peter orders his readers in verse 6 who are discouraged, who are deeply anxious, and very worried about many things, to humble themselves before God. To humble themselves before God, so that at the right time he might exalt them. The verb that Peter uses for humble yourselves, right, that's a command in verse 6, is actually a passive command rather than an active one. So verse 6 could read, be humbled. Let yourselves be humbled, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. Rather than telling his readers, you guys need to just make yourselves really humble before God, what Peter is calling his readers to do is to receive, to accept and embrace their hard, humbling, humiliating circumstances from God, trusting that at the right time God will vindicate and exalt them. And so what Peter's doing here is he's calling Christians to accept shame, to accept hardship, to accept hostility, pushback, and rejection when they encounter these things as they follow Jesus. But what exactly does it look like, right, for a person to be humble, to let themselves be humbled, to accept their circumstances from God before his mighty hand? Well, Peter explains what it looks like for a person to humble themselves before God in verse 7. Humility before God actually looks like a very surprising thing. Humbling ourselves before God looks like us casting our anxieties on him. One way that God deals with our anxieties is this: he gives us permission to acknowledge them in the first place. God gives us permission to acknowledge our anxieties before him. Simply by addressing anxieties in verse 7, Peter acknowledges that the worries and cares of this life we face are real. We don't have to pretend that we're too holy, or we're too faithful, or we're too righteous to have worries. God gives us the freedom to be completely honest about our anxieties. We can acknowledge them openly before him. We're allowed to say this to God. We're allowed to say, God, I am anxious about my family. We're able to say, God, I am anxious about my future. We're allowed to say, God, I am anxious about my kids. I'm anxious about my marriage. I'm anxious about my job. I'm anxious about our finances. I'm anxious about my health. Rather than avoiding our anxieties, as we often tend to do, God gives us beautiful, wonderful permission to acknowledge them honestly and openly before Him and also one another in the church. But while acknowledging our anxieties is a good and necessary starting point, God doesn't want us just to do that, just to admit and acknowledge our anxieties. A second way that God deals with our anxieties is He invites us to toss them to Him. God invites us to toss our anxieties to Him. Peter makes it clear in verse 7 that humbling yourself before God requires you to throw your anxieties on God. A person, therefore, who refuses to toss their anxieties to God and decides to hoard them and hold on to them is actually rebelling against God in pride. Pride is at the root of many of our worries, anxieties, and fears. While we might say that we believe God is good, while we might say and confess and sing that God is powerful and loving, we often don't actually believe these things about Him. Our unwillingness to toss our anxieties to God actually reveals our stubborn self-reliance, our stubborn self-will, and our stubborn self-dependency. Rather than humbling ourselves before God's mighty hand, we look to our own hands to provide and to protect and to preserve our lives in security. Rather than committing ourselves wholly and completely to God, we choose to bear the weight of the universe on our own two shoulders. One commentator had this to say about how pride is connected with our anxiety. He says this: worry is a form of pride, because when believers are filled with anxiety, they are convinced that they must solve all their problems in their lives by their own strength. The only God they trust is in themselves. When believers throw their worries upon God, they express their trust in His mighty hand, acknowledging that He is Lord and sovereign over all of life. There's a story that I remember hearing, maybe it was back in college. I love church history, and so it's a story that really stuck with me. The great German Protestant reformer, Martin Luther, who nailed his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany in 1517. He had a very close friend whose name was Philip Melanchthon. We can just call him Philip. And so Martin and Philip were this wonderful team of reformers. Martin was the fiery mouthpiece and debater, debating the Catholic Church, calling for reform, while Philip, his friend, was the more calm and collected and intellectual mind of the Protestant Reformation. Many scholars agree that Philip, Martin's friend, was more brilliant and scholarly than Luther himself. But Philip's one weakness was this: he had crippling anxiety. And so while Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon would be working late into the night, writing papers and treaties calling for the purification and reformation of the church, Philip would often say, "Flee to the mountains. The Reformation is over. It's not going to work." And so he'd express his fear and anxiety that what they were doing, which was actually a very dangerous thing, to challenge the Catholic Church, was a fool's errand, and that it would all end in their death and in nothingness. Whenever Philip would be consumed by worry, Martin Luther would come up behind him as a good friend and lay his hand on his friend's shoulder, and he would say this. He would say, "Let Philip cease to rule the world. let Philip cease to rule the world. God deals with our anxieties by inviting us to toss them to him. And Peter gives us the reason for why God can invite us so willingly to toss our anxieties to him. It's because, as he writes, he cares for us. If God did not care about us, he'd say something like, hey, you're on your own. Suck it up. Deal with it. Be tough. I'm not going to help you. You've got to figure this out on your own. But our God is not like some of our fathers have been to us. He genuinely cares for us. And his care is demonstrated in his willingness to bear with us and receive our anxieties when we toss them to him. Rather than hoarding and holding on to our anxieties, God deals with them by inviting us to toss them to him. And in verses 8 to 9, Peter addresses a third and final way that God deals with our anxieties. He equips us to resist our anxious accuser. He equips us to resist our anxious accuser. Peter calls his readers to humble themselves before God by tossing their anxieties to him, and also by wisely resisting their spiritual adversary, the devil. Peter's description of the devil as his reader's adversary, that term adversary, draws on courtroom language. An adversary is a word in Greek that would refer to something like a modern-day prosecutor in the courtroom. Maybe you've had experience dealing with a prosecutor in a lawsuit who is very aggressive and is just coming after you. The devil is portrayed in the scriptures as something of an aggressive prosecutor whose sole purpose and goal is to accuse, to slander, and to condemn believers. In the Old Testament, Satan brings a case against Job before God, arguing that the only reason why Job was righteous and obedient to God was because God had given him a good life. He'd given him a good family and a good job and a good house. And so Satan brings this case against Job, arguing that Job's only faithful to God because God has blessed him with wealth, with riches and status. And he makes this argument that if you take away these good things from Job's life, if you take away his wealth, if you take away his riches, if you take away his status and his family and his respect, then he will surely curse you and die. He must be only in it for himself. The devil is our anxious accuser, who, as Peter describes him in verse 8, he prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. A lion's roar is meant to frighten, to intimidate and discourage his enemies. I'm not gonna roar like a lion for you, but maybe Hadassah can do it for us at some point. Right? A lion's roar is meant to frighten and intimidate and discourage enemies. Likewise, Satan roars against Christians, accusing them, slandering them, discouraging them, seeking to dissuade and deter them from following Jesus. Satan wants Christians to feel as if God has abandoned them and that they're the only ones having a hard time in the whole wide world. Behind every slanderous word, every division within the church, every deceptive scheme is our anxious accuser. Sometimes he will pile on the discouragement, while at other times he will divert your attention away from God and towards yourself. Yet while Satan may and does roar, his roar is not the roar of a true and mighty lion. Satan's roars come from his own fear and his own anxiety, because he knows that he's already lost. We, on the other hand, have a lion who roars with unrivaled authority. Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, he who has conquered all things. Right? Jesus is in the book of Revelation, in John's from the Apostle John, the last book of the New Testament. Jesus is portrayed both as the Lamb as well as the Lion at the same time. He's both humbled and exalted. He is the Lamb who was slain, and at the same time, he is the Lion who has conquered our enemy. And so with the Lion of Judah on our side, the last way God deals with our anxieties is he equips us to resist our anxious accuser. Let me now address how these truths of how God deals with our anxieties might look in our own lives. The first thing to take into account is this, that overcoming anxiety requires humility. Overcoming anxiety requires humility. Each of us have to recognize that at the root of not all, but many of our worries and our anxieties is pride and self-absorption. Anxieties multiply when we situate ourselves at the center of the universe. And so in time, each of us must be willing to let go of ourselves, to let go of our pride, to let go of our security, to let go of our status and our control, and entrust ourselves to God's mighty hand if we're to find freedom from our own anxieties. Dr. George Alport, he's a Harvard psychologist who pioneered research in the study of personality. He observed that underneath much anxiety lies the sin of pride. I don't think he's a Christian, but he's reflecting on actually how underneath a lot of our anxiety is pride. And this is what he has to say. He says, any neurotic, any person dealing with an anxiety disorder, is living a life which in some respects is extreme in its self-centeredness. The region of his misery represents a complete preoccupation with himself. The very nature of the neurotic disorder is tied to pride. If the sufferer is hypersensitive, resentful, captious, he may be indicating a fear that he will not appear to advantage in competitive situations where he wants to show his worth. If he is chronically indecisive, he can't make a decision one way or the other, he's showing fear that he may do the wrong thing and be discredited. If he is over-scrupulous and self-critical, he may be endeavoring to show how praiseworthy he really is. And he concludes this way, thus most neuroses are from the point of religion mixed with the sin of pride. And so overcoming anxiety first requires humility. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind as we wrestle with and God deals with our own anxieties before him. A second is this. I want to encourage you to love your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ by reminding them that God is God and that they are not. Seek to be a Martin Luther to a Philip, right? Tell your friends, your spouse, your family members, we need people in our lives who are willing to say, let your name, insert your name, cease to rule the world. Elder Jung invited me to go on a one-night retreat with him a few weeks ago to pray, to plan, and prepare for ECC next year. And honestly, I was a bit reluctant to do so, as I felt like there's still a lot of work to be done. But I agreed to attend. And so this past afternoon, Wednesday afternoon to Thursday morning, Elder Jung and I, we spent hours walking and talking with one another at a retreat center in Mount Angel, about an hour south from here. And it was very refreshing for me and very encouraging. Elder Jung, as a faithful elder, what he was doing, when I realized that this is actually what was happening, is Elder Jung, as an elder, was pastoring me. He was pastoring me. And he was caring for my soul. And I really needed his care. And one of the things that Elder Jung reminded me is what Martin Luther reminds Philip, his friend. Elder Jung reminded me that God is God and that I am not. He gently and firmly called me to rely on God, not myself, and to give my fears and anxieties and worries to God. And so the message that I received from our time together was, let Joshua cease to rule the world. This is a very practical way that we as followers of Jesus can practically love each other by calling one another to cease from ruling the world as if we were God. That's what love looks like. And lastly, one final exhortation is to keep an eye out for our anxious accuser, right? Our anxious accuser, the devil, will seek to divide and discourage and distract us in many ways next year. He will seek to sow discord among us, and he's done much to make life more difficult for our church. There are fewer things that I think can imagine that Satan would want to disrupt or destroy or distort more than a new church that's being planted. When Hamas, launched their surprise attack on Israel early on the morning of October 7th, they used diversionary tactics. They launched a bunch of missiles, and under the cover of these missiles, they sent in their infantry to attack and break through the walls of Israel. And what's really striking about everything that happened with October 7th is that Hamas did very little to try to hide what they were planning. All of their training videos were uploaded online, and the Israeli intelligence were able to watch them rehearsing every step of the operation. Israel knew fully well what Hamas had been practicing, but their fatal mistake was to not take them seriously, to not see them as a serious threat. And Hamas had bet that the Israelis' pride and complacency would blind them from what they were actually planning to do, and they were proven correct. Our anxious accuser will use various tactics to seek to undermine our unity and love for one another. He's betting that we won't see him coming, that our pride and our complacency will give him an opportunity to strike. And yet, even when he lands a blow on us, God assures us of what he will do for us in the end, in verse 10. God promises to restore, to confirm, to strengthen, and establish us. He is our mighty fortress, our bulwark never failing. This is the promise and the hope that we celebrate during the season of Christmas, that when Christ returns, he will put all things right. As a skilled doctor is able to set a broken bone back into its proper place, Jesus will heal everything that has been broken in you and me in this world by sin. I want to close with reading the lyrics of a hymn that I really love, written by the Irish hymn writer Thomas Moore. And the hymn is called Come Ye Disconsolate. And the lyrics of this song go as follows. Come ye disconsolate, those wherever ye may languish. Come to the mercy seat, fervently kneel. Here bring your wounded hearts. Here tell your anguish. Earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot heal. Joy of the desolate, light of the straying, hope of the penitent, faithless and pure, here speaks the Comforter tenderly saying, earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot cure. Here, see the bread of life, see waters flowing forth from the throne of God, pure from above. Come to the feast of love, come ever knowing, earth has no sorrow, but heaven can remove.